Mr. Luckman and I welcome you to another discussion of the great ideas. Today, we continue with the discussion of learning. Mr. Luckman is here to ask me questions of the sort that may arise in your mind as we proceed with this discussion. Learning is a large subject, not quite as large as education, but nevertheless quite large. And so we shall deal mainly with human learning, the kind of learning that results in the improvement of the mind, the kind of learning in which teachers can be of some help to us. Now, I'd like to make a wager with you. I would be willing to bet that I can guess what images come into your mind as I use the words learning and teaching. My guess is, that you tend to call before your mind the image of a teacher standing in a classroom at a blackboard with children at their seats. Am I right? Is that what you think of when you think of learning and teaching and the process of education?
Well, I won't tell you whether that's what I think of until you tell me what's wrong with the picture.
Well, there's nothing wrong with the picture itself. Learning and teaching certainly go on in classrooms and schools. But I think that it is wrong to let that image and the conceptions of learning and teaching that go with it crowd other images and meanings out of our minds. I think the deepest and most serious error we can make about education, and one, by the way, that is made on all sides, by educators and by teachers, as well as by the public generally, is to identify education with schooling. Or even to suppose that what goes on, the kind of learning that goes on in school, and I mean everything from kindergarten to college, is the main part of education. Or to suppose that the kind of learning that children do in school that's the main business of childhood and only of childhood. That learning belongs to childhood primarily, and that most learning can be done in childhood, and that all that adults have to do is to use the learning that is acquired in school when we are very young. Now, if any of you do suppose that, and I fear that many of you may, I would like to have you follow me closely now, because I'm going to try to convince you of the very opposite. I'm going to try to show you three things which I have stated here in this chart, and I'm going to try to explain their truth as we proceed with this discussion. The first is that learning is the process of a whole lifetime. The second is that adult learning is the most important part of anyone's education. And the third is that schooling, or learning in school, is at best only preparation for the kind of learning that must be done because it only can be done in adult life. Now, let me comment for a moment on that third point. Schooling fails miserably if it does not prepare young people to carry on learning after they leave school, carry on learning for the rest of their lives. Anyone who doesn't understand this, I think, fails to understand one of the most important points in the philosophy of education, a point that John Dewey has so repeatedly stressed when he has said that all learning is for the sake of more learning, just as every phase of growth is for the sake of further growth. And so, one might almost say, the whole purpose of schooling, or of the learning that we do in school, is to prepare us for the kind of learning we have to do and ought to do after we leave school for the rest of our lives. Now, you will notice that I just said the kind of learning we have to do or ought to do. I don't mean in saying that to imply that adult education is compulsory. We know that it isn't. We know, I think, that it shouldn't be. But the fact that it isn't compulsory by no means excludes it from being necessary. Adult learning is necessary for all of us, for everyone, whether they've been through school and college or not?
Well, you know, I think I see what you mean, but I'm really not sure that you've made the point quite clear, Dr. Adler, because the question that remains in my mind, for example, is this adult learning that's so necessary to the same extent and in the same way for those adults who have had schooling and adequate schooling as against those who are not fortunate enough to have quite as much schooling as this other group?
No, I think I have made my point quite clear. Let me see if I can distinguish two things. Mr. Luckman asks whether adult learning is necessary to the same extent and in the same way for those who have gone through school and college and those who have not. My answer is no. Those who, in their youth, have been deprived of the advantages of schooling may have to return to school in adult life. But that return to school is adult schooling, not adult learning. One might better describe it as remedial adult schooling because it makes up for the deficiency, for the deprivation that these people suffered in their youth. This would not happen in a perfectly good society. In a good society, no one would be deprived of education, of adequate schooling in youth. And that quite makes the point. Because in a good society in which no one was deprived of adequate schooling in youth, adult learning would still be necessary for everyone. As necessary then as it is now for those who have completed school and college. And the reason why that is so is that learning is a lifetime affair, not just something that belongs to childhood, not just the duty and privilege of children. Learning is far too important to be relinquished to childhood. Let me show you what I mean by a whole lifetime of learning. In this chart, I think I can show you the phases of learning throughout a human lifetime. We begin with preschool learning for the very young, at home, before kindergarten. And then the second phase of learning is all the grades, all the degrees of schooling from the grades, the beginning grades, through college, for children and young people. And then two subordinate kinds of schooling: adult schooling for those who in their youth were underprivileged, who didn't have adequate schooling in youth, and postgraduate schooling for those who want to specialize in a profession or some special field of learning. All this is schooling. And what I'm talking about is something that comes after all schooling and out of all schools, adult learning, which is for everyone. Now, that's the picture I'd like to have you hold before you as we proceed with this discussion. And what I'd like to have you remember about this picture is that it's the last part which is the most important part, the part which all the rest is preparation. You remember the lines of Browning? Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first is made. Well, that applies to learning as well as to life.
Well, no, you may be right about this, but I'm really sure, Dr. Adler, that there are a lot of people who think otherwise, and you've indicated that you agree with that point. And I feel it's not because they think of learning as the duty of childhood alone, but rather that they think of it as young people have a capacity to learn that adults lose. The older we get, the less we are able to learn. You know the old adage, can't teach an old dog new tricks.
I'm afraid you're right, Mr. Luckman, and that's what people do think. And I think what we ought to do about that is see if we can change their conception on this point, their impression. Perhaps you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but human beings are not old dogs, and adult learning does not consist in acquiring new tricks. I think the source of the error lies in a fundamental confusion that many people make between confusion of bodily growth with mental growth. Now, there's no question that our bodies grow very rapidly when we're very young, and that we cease to grow, physically cease to grow, when we reach the ages of 16 or 18. But short of pathological senility, the mind can grow beyond that point. The mind, short of pathological senility, never loses its power of growth. It always retains that power of growth as long as our bodies remain healthy. Let me show you by two curves on a blackboard the difference between the career, the pattern of bodily growth and the pattern of mental growth. Along the bottom line here are the ages of human life. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, up to 70 years, the normal span. And let this vertical line represent amounts of learning, or amounts of growth, rather. Now, the body normally grows very rapidly at first and then tapers off about the age of 16 or 18. And here, in contrast, is the curve of the mind's power of growth. That curve starts very slowly, and the great accumulations of learning occur toward the end, the last years of our life. Now, this, it seems to me, expresses the simple basic truth that we are never too old to learn. But along with that goes another basic truth, that we are sometimes too young to learn. This is the reason why adult learning is necessary for all of us. Because when we are immature, we are simply too young to learn some of the most important things that every human being must come to know. Let me explain this last point a little more clearly. Let me tell you what every schoolboy doesn't know. And as I use the word schoolboy, I'm referring to anyone in school or college, because anyone while still in school or college is, in my judgment, a young person and can be so called. No one, I think, would think of speaking of a mature schoolboy. Now, what is it that every schoolboy doesn't know, especially at the moment of graduation? It is how little he knows and how much he has to learn. But that is precisely what everyone who has been out of school or college for 5 years comes to realize very clearly. That is true, Mr. Luckman, is it not? Well, aren't most of the people you know who are out of college for 4 or 5 years, haven't they come to realize how little they know and how much they have to learn?
Well, I not only think so, but I strongly hope so, Dr. Adler.
Well, if there are people who don't know this, the only charitable thing to do is not to speak of them any further as we go on. Now, though most college graduates do know that they didn't learn very much in college, most of them give a wrong interpretation of the fact. In fact, they give one or another wrong interpretation. They either say that the school they went to was not good, the curriculum wasn't good, the faculty was poor, and that's why they learned so little in school or college. Or they say, no, the school was good and the curriculum was good, the faculty was extremely good, but I frittered away my time. I didn't work hard or conscientiously enough. That's why I didn't learn enough in school or college. Now, both of these things may be true, but neither is the really right reason why we do not learn enough in school or college. To prepare you for what I think is the right interpretation of the fact, let me ask you to imagine this case. Imagine the very best school with the very best faculty, the perfect curriculum, and imagine the student who, for the years that he's in school, applies himself most conscientiously to the business of study and learning. Now, even in that case, that student would not graduate an educated man, needing no further education, not needing to go on with learning, finding it necessary to go on with learning throughout the rest of life. And the reason why that is so is that youth is itself the great and insurmountable obstacle to getting an education. Now, this may seem like a shocking or an exaggerated statement. I don't think it is. Let me try to explain it. The explanation, I think, is to be found by looking at the end products of the whole of learning. Let's consider what it is that the whole of learning aims at. Now, I would say that what all of us want, or certainly should want, is to acquire some understanding of ourselves and the world in which we live. Only fools have no desire to become a little wiser. All the rest of us, I think, hope to get some wisdom as a result of our efforts at learning. But the point is, that is the end result. Wisdom cannot be acquired in school when we are young. Would anyone, for example, think of calling a college boy or girl, while they were in college or just as they were getting out of college, wise. Well, what is true of wisdom is equally true of understanding. The understanding which consists of basic insights into the nature of life or of society or of the world in which we live. The immature person lacks the experience and the seriousness of purpose to gain such understanding. One might almost say their minds or souls are too shallow soil for basic ideas to take root in. Now, this is not a new point. Most of the great educators have always recognized or known this, and certainly all teachers should know it, even if some of them unfortunately do not. For example, if we were to take Plato off the shelf here and examine that passage in the Republic, or that book in the Republic, where he deals with the process of human education, we would find that he does not think that the consideration of fundamental ideas should be begun until a man is almost 45. The study of ideas and the acquirement of wisdom is really postponed until the latter half of life, until after 50. Or, if we were to go to Aristotle's Ethics, I think we would find Aristotle at the very opening of the Ethics saying that moral subjects, ethics and politics, should not be taught to young men because they lack the experience, they lack the emotional stability, they lack that deep seriousness without which the subject cannot be understood. Let me talk briefly of my own experience as a teacher. I've always found it easy to teach abstract and theoretical subjects to young people in college. Much more difficult to teach moral philosophy, deal with moral and political questions. It is very difficult, for example, to read great novels and plays with young people, novels and plays that deal with life's most serious problems. I've read and discussed novels and plays with young people in college and with adults, and the difference is as day and night. And let me give you one further piece of evidence. When I left college, I was pretty sure that I understood some of the great books I had the good fortune to read there, but I was more fortunate in my teaching career to have to reread some of those books many times. And I know now that I didn't understand those books at all when I was in college. In fact, I know now that I didn't understand them very well 10 years ago. It's not that I'm any brighter now. I'm simply older. Hasn't that been your experience, Mr. Luckman, as a teacher also?
Yes, it has indeed, and I'm sure we could say that it's the experience of most teachers who go on studying the subjects after their experience in school and the years of their teaching experience, as you've pointed out. Now, Dr. Adler, I agree with you in this main point that you've just made so well and what you're saying, but I think you're going a little too far. And why I think so is that I think you're giving the impression that almost nothing can be learned in school, that we're absolutely wasting education on young people.
Well, I don't want to give that impression, Mr. Luckman. Let me see if I can correct the impression Mr. Luckman says I am giving. I certainly am not saying that children are uneducable. But I am saying that adults are more educable than children, just as children are more trainable than adults. What I really mean to say that is that children can form habits of body and even habits of mind more readily than adults. The pattern of the growth of habits follows very closely the pattern of bodily growth. Let me put that line, that curve on the blackboard along with the others to show you. This curve here closely resembles the curve of bodily growth. Habits are accumulated, habits are formed very quickly in life and are formed during the early years of life, but not after the 20th or 25th year. They don't go on the way the real growth of the mind goes on until the end of life. Certainly, the thing we should understand here is that adults can learn better what it takes depth of thought and breadth of experience to learn. If adults can think better than children can, then certainly on all fundamentals they should be able, and I think are able, to learn better. That's clear, isn't it?
Yes, but I'd still like to know what sort of learning then you think should be done in school, Dr. Adler, and how then schooling really differs from adult learning.
Well, Mr. Luckman asks, what should take place in school, if in my opinion, the major part of learning, the major acquisition of knowledge and wisdom occurs in adult life. My answer to Mr. Luckman, and to you, if you are interested in the question, is that there are two things that a good school should do if the school performs its function of being preparation for the life of learning that is to take place when school is finished, when men and women leave school. The first thing a good school should do is to give the child the skills of learning. If learning is to go on for a lifetime after school, one should learn how to learn. The arts and skills of learning in school, all the techniques like reading and writing and talking and listening that are involved in learning should be acquired in school. That's one of the main functions of schooling. And the second is, in view of the fact that human beings, if they're going to acquire any wisdom or any deep understanding of the nature of things, must do it after they leave school, the second thing a good school should do in preparation for the life of learning that is to follow is to give the child some acquaintance with the world of learning. And not only an acquaintance with it, but some incentive, some real stimulation to go on learning when they leave school. The child should realize in a good school that he hasn't learned everything and should have the feeling about what there is to learn and the drive and the motivation to go on with that life of learning. Now, that is part of the answer to your question, but only part. The other part has to do with the real distinction, the whole distinction between learning in school and adult learning. And I think what I'd like to add to what I've already said is that learning in school is something that takes place for a period of time, always a limited period of time, whereas adult learning, by its very nature, is interminable. It goes on without end. It is perfectly all right for a schoolboy to say, I have finished with my schooling. But is it all right for an adult to say, I have finished with adult learning, unless he's also willing to say, I am done with my life? One reason why adult learning is endless, must go on interminably throughout a whole life, one reason for this is that it aims at wisdom. And wisdom is hard come by. Not much of it can be acquired short of a whole lifetime of pursuit. But that is not the only reason. Not enough that it takes a lifetime to gain wisdom. The other reason is that to live is to grow. And as soon as we stop growing, we begin to die. The body, the human body, when it stops growing, really begins to die, it begins to decline. And the mind, however, can keep on growing past this point when the body stops growing and begins to die, but only on condition that we go on learning. When we stop learning, then the mind also ceases to grow and begins to die. It begins to die in atrophy just the way the body does. Now, everyone, I think, understands what is necessary for the care and feeding of their bodies. They know that they must give their bodies daily sustenance if they're going to keep them healthy and strong. They know they must exercise their body if they're going to keep their muscles from becoming flabby. But what applies to the care of the body applies equally to the care of the mind, just as to keep our bodies healthy and strong, we must feed them regularly and exercise them, just as we can't keep them healthy and strong on last year's feeding and exercise, so we can't keep our minds alive and growing on last year's reading and learning. You know Mark Twain's remark, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. Well, when anyone stops learning, the reports of his death, the death of his mind, are not greatly exaggerated, no matter how long he continues to live after that. Now, last time, we talked about the role of motivation in learning. But at that time, we were thinking mainly of children and of learning in school. And there, the problem of motivation is hard to solve. But in the case of adult learning, which we are considering now, I think the problem of motivation is not nearly so hard to solve. When any adult realizes that wisdom is the end result he is pursuing, and that it's hard to acquire wisdom. When any adult realizes that unless he goes on learning, he cannot go on growing and keeping his mind alive and strong. Those two realizations are almost enough as the motivation for adults to carry on learning for a lifetime. Also, last time we talked about the role of teachers, and there we were thinking mainly of classroom teachers or college lecturers. But as I pointed out at the beginning of this discussion, that is the wrong image in the case of adult learning. If we're thinking about adult learning, a much better image to have in mind is of a man sitting down by himself with a book, reading. Or, even better image, a group of adults talking to one another, discussing some basic problem or issue, and each of them teaching the others and learning from the others. For in the Republic of Learning, of adult learning, the most important thing is that each adult is himself a teacher and also a learner. Now, books are teachers for adults, and adults can learn by discussing important themes or problems with one another. So, in the next two sessions of this discussion, I would like to deal with these two things: how adults can learn by reading books, and how adults can learn by discussing problems with their fellow men. And then, in the final discussion of learning, I would like to have us face together the problem of whether and how adults can learn from television. I hope all these subjects interest you, and that you will stay with us throughout the remaining sessions of this discussion of the great idea of learning. Thank you very much.